Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to do a drawing of this red rose, and I'm going to show you how you can make your own pastel paper. More specifically, I'm going to talk about how you can create toned pastel paper using clear gesso. In one of my previous videos I did a demonstration, a drawing of a pine tree, where I showed you how you can use clear gesso to create pastel paper from regular drawing paper, because clear gesso creates a textured surface that's very similar to sanded paper, and it just holds the pastel a little bit better. And in this video we're going to talk about how you can create toned pastel paper, and to do that you're just going to need a couple of things. You're going to need some paint, either acrylics or gouache or watercolor, it doesn't really matter, and then we're going to go over that with clear gesso. And then I'm going to do a bit of testing, and I'm going to do a demonstration of this drawing of a rose. Like I said, clear gesso for me works pretty well with pastels. It gets the job done. It's not as good as some of the high quality pastel papers, obviously, but it's a very cheap alternative. Also, if you already have some toned paper, you can just go over that with some clear gesso and that will also work. But if you don't like the color of your pastel, of your toned paper, and you want to create some toned pastel paper in any color you like, then you just use this method that I'm about to show you now. So the first thing you need is a piece of paper. It has to be a slightly thicker paper, at least 200 GSM, 300 is even better, so that it doesn't get wavy. And then of course you need a brush and you need some paint. Like I said, acrylics, gouache, watercolor, either one of those will work fine. You just choose a color you like, or you mix in a color you like, and you go over the paper. You can also use a piece of paper that you've already used for something else, like maybe you've done some sketching or drawing on it, and you can just repaint it and use it for a new project. So that's another neat thing. Just you have to make sure that you cover it evenly if that's important to you. And once you get a nice smooth coverage, you'll be ready to go over it with clear gesso. If that's not as important to you, because you're going to be painting over it anyway, you don't have to spend as much time making sure that you distribute the paint evenly. But like I said, if you want to create a nice looking toned paper, you can just choose a nice color and spread it around evenly. So once it's dry, it's going to be too smooth to work with pastels, I think, and you're going to need to add a little bit of clear gesso so that it would work better, because like I said, clear gesso creates a textured surface that's similar to sanded paper. But you have to make sure that the paper is dry first. So after it's dry, you add a little bit of clear gesso, and I just poured a few drops of it here and there, and I can add a little bit more if I need to. I didn't want to dip my brush into my jar of clear gesso because I'm afraid that it might reactivate the color on the paper, so I don't want to mess up the gesso in my jar. So I can just pour a few drops here and there, and it's going to work just as well. And I can just spread that with a brush. This process will require a bit of patience and practice, and it can be a little bit messy at times, but it's really not that difficult. I mean, if somebody like me who always works in dry media can do it, you can do it as well. All you have to do is make sure that you spread that gesso very evenly in a very thin coat, so that you cover all of the edges and all of the corners. That's very important because you want a nice even coverage with that clear gesso. And clear gesso is a primer, like I've already explained in my previous video. It contains either marble dust or calcium carbonate, and it creates that textured surface. Now, a larger brush will create some brush strokes, some texture. If you don't like that, you can use a smaller brush to soften that texture a little bit, but what works even better is if you dilute the gesso a little bit. That'll make it grip the pastel a little bit less, but it still works. So here I have two pieces of paper, toned and covered with clear gesso. I'm going to use this larger one for the rose. I'm going to use this smaller one for a bit of testing. And I'm also going to use another piece of paper, white regular paper that's not been covered with any gesso, because I want to do a small comparison. I'm just going to test some of the soft pastels and pastel pencils. And as you can see from the color of my tone paper, clear gesso is completely transparent when it dries. It looked a little bit whitish while I worked, but it's transparent now. So I'm going to compare how my pastel pencils work on regular paper here on the left and on this toned paper with clear gesso on the right. As you can see, the coverage is much better. The colors are much fuller, much more vibrant than on regular paper. The surface just grips the pastel a lot better, and these are fairly soft pastel pencils. I'm using Koh-i-Noor soft pastels and Koh-i-Noor Gioconda pastel pencils, and you can see that even with lighter colors, this surface simply holds the pastel a lot better. Look at how that red color is kind of pale, but look at how strong and vibrant it is when I go over clear gesso, and I'm not using any more pressure. If you hear a louder noise, that's because there's more friction, because the texture is more rough. And blue here is somewhat similar. The green, also similar, but still a little bit better on a surface that's been covered with clear gesso. Now let's try to draw some smaller, lighter details. I'm going to have to resharpen my pencil. I'm going to use a lighter color, something like a light peach or something, to go over some of these darker areas. Now let's see what happens. On clear gesso, I can get very, very clean lines, very clean edge to value, nice contrast. But if I try to do the same thing on regular paper, the mark is a little bit more muddied, and I don't get as much contrast. It would be a little bit difficult to draw something detailed with a lot of layers. So you can clearly see that this thing works a bit better. Now let me just say a few words why you would want to use toned paper in the first place. Well, there are two reasons essentially. The first reason is maybe in your reference photo you have a dominant color. Like for example, you're drawing a greenscape and there's a lot of grass and foliage and things like that, and you want a green toned paper like mine or something. And you want to use that base color. You want to utilize that background color so that you can add some darker greens and some lighter greens for the highlights on top. So that can be useful. Now the second reason is actually quite the opposite. Sometimes you want to use the contrast. So in this case I'm drawing some grass and I'm actually using this green background, and it's helping me create my greenscape. But if I wanted to draw a subject that will stand out against the background, I would actually be using the background to create contrast, and that's going to be the case in my drawing because I'm going to be drawing a red flower. And not only is there going to be contrast in terms of value, there's also going to be contrast because red and green are complementary colors. So the red flower will stand out nicely against that background. So those are some of the reasons why you would want to use toned paper. It helps you increase the range of value easily. It helps you bring contrast. And now we're going to do that demonstration. First, I'm going to do the sketch. I'm going to do the sketch with a colored pencil, with a red colored pencil, because it's just a little bit easier to sharpen, and it will allow me to produce some finer lines which I can correct more easily. And the pencil I'm using is a Pastel colored pencil, but I'm not going to be using it much later. I'm just going to do a very simple sketch. I'm kind of eyeballing this. It doesn't have to be precise because the petals of this rose, they're going to look kind of uneven, and I don't need to get the proportions exactly right. There's no need to trace or measure or do anything of a sort. I can just do a freehand sketch, and I think it's still going to look very nice. I'm just kind of trying to break up that rose into some segments so that I can show those petals, and I think my composition looks pretty good. I placed the rose roughly in the middle of the paper. It probably should have gone a little bit lower than that, but it's still fine. So I'm switching to pastel pencils now. I'm going to say a few more words about my materials again, in case you're interested in that. I'm using Koh-i-Noor Gioconda pastel pencils, and that's what I'm mostly going to be using. The soft pastels I'm going to be using are also Koh-i-Noor soft pastels. Both of these are very soft and vibrant, and they have some strong colors. In addition to those, I'm also going to be using some Conte à Paris pastel pencils. Now here I used a bit of sponge to try to blend the pastels a little bit, but I found that for some reason blending doesn't work that well on clear gesso on this surface. I don't really know how it is on other pastel papers. I don't really have that much experience with higher quality, artist quality pastel papers. I've seen what they do, but I haven't really worked on them much, so I can't make a comparison. But here, these pastel blending tools such as sponges, they honestly don't work that well, and tortillons certainly don't work, because I've tried, as you can see, and they seem to take away a little bit of the pigment, and I don't really like that effect. So what I ended up doing most of the time when it comes to blending, as you will see, is I simply ended up using my pastel pencils for blending, simply going over the darker values with a lighter value, with a lighter pencil, and kind of muddying and blending things together, and that seemed to be producing the best looking effects. So now, because the rose, the flower obviously is kind of complex. It has a lot of these petals, it has multiple parts, and it has some of these shadow areas, and the lighter areas are where these petals are sticking out. So I decided to use a black pastel pencil to put in some of the darker areas so that I can kind of explain the shape and the structure of the flower, not just to the viewer but also to myself, so that I could speed up the drawing process. So once I put in some of these darker areas, it was kind of easier for me to understand what I need to do, because if I just go over everything with red, then that would kind of defeat the purpose of my sketch. But this way it helps me make some progress easier, and it helps me navigate through this drawing a little bit more easily. I still use that sponge. It's kind of like a foamy material that you would find on mouse pads. I still use that here and there, but like I said, I didn't really like the effect much, because most of the time I found myself blending using either my fingers for the larger areas where I don't need precision, or simply using my pencils, blending them one over the other. And what you need to remember, and you would probably realize this yourself if you did a little bit of testing, pastel pencils behave differently depending on which one you apply first. So if you apply the lighter one first, you will have slightly different effects than if you have applied the darker one first. But generally, when you use lighter colored pencil, or lighter rather pastel pencils on top of the darker areas, you will get nicely blended areas which will become a little bit muddied. The color will become not only less dark, there will be less contrast, and there will be a bit of mixing. So pastel pencils behave quite a bit differently than colored pencils, and blending is easier here. And on this surface I don't really have to worry about adding layers or drawing on top of the areas I've already covered, because clear gesso will allow me to put in a few layers and maybe even correct some of my mistakes as I go along, without actually having to worry too much about planning and putting everything in the right place. I also tried adding a bit of yellow to some of the highlights, to some of the lighter areas, because I wanted to produce a slightly warmer color where some of the lighter areas are. But I didn't really do too much with that. I decided to use a combination of white, red and black just to keep it simple, and I think it worked fine. Here I'm starting to work a little bit on the background, and even though I am using this base color, greenish color that I created on my toned paper, I'm going to be modifying it quite a bit, and I'm going to be covering almost all of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a bit of a lighter color to it, and I worked around the edges a little bit. So I went over that with some light olive green, and this is a Conte pastel pencil, and then I added some other greens on top of that. I added some slightly darker greens, using my soft pastel sticks. So I added those in, and I blended those with those lighter areas, creating smooth transitions, mostly with my finger, but still trying to be careful not to ruin the edges too much, because even though your fingers are great blending tools, unfortunately, depending on their size, they are usually not particularly precise when drawing. So here I have a bit of that stem, which is a little bit darker in color, and some leaves, and I'm also working around them, adding some areas of darker color. So my idea with the background is to create an out of focus bouquet type of background, where we have some suggestions of some greenish tones, like maybe there's a garden in the background. There are some lighter green tones where maybe some light is coming through, and some darker green tones like maybe shadows from some of the other plants and leaves and things like that. So those are just some of the suggestions of some variations in the background, and we can leave some of these things to the imagination of the viewer. I don't have to explain everything in my drawing. All I have to do is create some kind of a background that will allow my subject to stand out and to pop out of the paper and to capture the attention and the focus of the viewer. I'm moving on towards the central part of the flower, using that red pastel pencil and covering more and more of that flower. Notice that there are a few of these green spaces coming through when I don't cover everything, and in those cases I have to go back and I have to cover everything with that red color, because as I've already explained, blending doesn't really work very well on this type of surface. So it's best to just use your pastel pencils most of the time when you can't use your finger. So that's what I ended up doing. I stopped relying on my blending tools, and in order to get clean, even coverage, I simply used my pastel pencils and I blended them one over the other. Now you can see that with these darker areas, I put in the black first, and then I start with the lighter areas, the reddish areas, and then I sort of gently push from the lighter areas towards the darker areas and kind of muddy things in between, creating a nice mid-tone in between, creating a nice shadow area in between. I'm going to do this here in the central part as well. So adding a bit of black first, then muddying it a little bit with a red color, and you get a nice looking shadow color. I can even add a little bit of greenish color to those shadow areas because, like I said, this is a complementary color and it will further enhance that contrast. I can also add a bit of lighter colors like that white to create some lighter areas around the highlights where some of these petals are sticking out, and obviously they are closer to the light source and getting more light from above. But it is this range of value between the lighter and darker areas that will create that three-dimensional look in my rose, because I need to try to convey that feeling of volume and depth in my drawing so that the viewer can really feel like this is a three-dimensional object, like some of these petals are sticking out, like they're stacked in layers. I'm moving on closer to the center of the flower, and this is where things are getting more and more complex because there are many of these layers of petals. And one of the first things I'm doing is trying to explain this whole thing to myself by drawing some of the darker areas so that I can know where the shadow areas are, and then I'm sort of drawing in between them using the red pastel pencil. And one of the things that I kept pushing myself to do was to cover the whole thing, cover the whole area that I'm working on, because of the rough texture of the paper, I would sometimes get these green dots which weren't covered, small areas where the background color was coming through, and that was not a good look. And like I said, blending didn't really work that well on those, because if I tried blending, the color would become less vibrant. So I would just use more pastel, which is a risky strategy because you're saturating the tooth of the paper, but like I said, the tooth was still rough enough for me to be able to do everything I wanted to add all of the layers that I wanted to. I'm working on the background again, adding some of these darker areas again using this dark green pastel. And I'm not really adding those dark green areas completely randomly, because my goal is to create some kind of a balance in my composition, not just in terms of the elements, but also in terms of the values. So, and also I'm not placing those areas of lighter and darker value entirely randomly either, because it's all in the purpose of making my main subject pop out. So basically, the background is there for a reason, not just to have something in the background, but also to help kind of emphasize some of the features of the main subject in the foreground. But you can see how, even though the texture of this paper is really rough, clear gesso is really rough, but when you're using pastels you can blend everything very, very smoothly, and you can get a very smooth looking, out of focus looking background, as if you used pan pastels or some other tool. So that's a very nice effect that you can create, and you wouldn't really be able to do that with colored pencils. I tried working with colored pencils on clear gesso, and I just couldn't get the results that I wanted. Pastels do work a bit better on this surface. I'm refining the appearance of the leaves a little bit. I wasn't really happy with the way they turned out, and after I did a bit of work on the leaves, I'm back to working on the flower. I have to refine the central part of the flower and break that up into many of these smaller petals rolled into the center. So I kind of muddied some of these areas a little bit, but that's okay because this part of the flower is in the shadow anyway. There are just a few parts, just a few of these petals which are sticking out a little bit and need to be a bit lighter, but other than that it's mostly going to be in the shadow, and I'm going to have a little bit more of those darker areas here. I'm just refining some of the edges and pushing the contrast in some of the areas, and maybe adding a bit of texture here and there so that some of these petals would look a little bit more convincing. But other than that, I think these are just some of the finishing touches. This is a very small drawing, just I don't really know, maybe 5 inches in height or so. So I just wanted to do a nice small drawing of flower and do a demonstration and a bit of testing, and I hope you will like this drawing, and I hope that some of the testing I've done and some of these explanations will be useful to some of you. As usual, if you want to check out my other videos, don't forget to browse through my channel, browse through my videos, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to be notified about my new videos, don't forget to click the notification icon. And if you want to see more content and longer videos, you can always go and check out my Patreon. I'm going to put the link to the other drawing on clear gesso, the pine tree. I'm going to put the link in the description and in the end screen so that you can check that out as well. I'm just putting down some finishing touches on the background, making everything a little bit smoother and a little bit more balanced. And I've also removed the tape that was around the corners, so I'm fixing that as well. And also putting down some of the finishing touches on the flower itself. Refining some of these darker areas, adding a touch of black to some of the darkest shadow areas, so that we can have really nice range of value. And there's my signature. I put it in the lower right corner. Thanks again for watching. I'm going to see you in the next video. Bye for now.